Genova's memory-altering rewriting of history is the function of the secrets from the secret empire engaged in the coup against the United States for the white nationalists, which has actively infected the rest of the world concerning the offenses plotted in the rewrite, which has subsequently obstructed the existence of the free market, which, under the learned elders of Zion and other strategies, has actively used criminal actions from the protocols as a standard strategy to overthrow the country. In this arrangement, you have the creation of the observations, uh, compromising of the Sephiroth, which is the Japanese super elite, so the highest ranked member who would be feeling offended by the existence of the rest of the international community or local community within regards to the subject not being respected enough as much as he is owed, would actively have been manipulated in this arrangement, at which point the function of David's companies would subdivide into the faculties, and the faculties in that arrangement are basically the characters from the various pieces of entertainment concerning the disillusionment of the structure, including the function of the super soldier from Japan, who, being the hyper elite, is the preferred leader of many of these arrangements, exponentially meaning that he would be owed a lot more than what he would have been provided by the Genova character from the white nationalists. At which point, the white nationalists, still being sore from World War II, are still racist against the Japanese and would actively hold it against them. So anyone who would have actively promoted the Japanese would have been viewed as problematic and subversive. And David's companies actively having an alliance treaty with Japan, as well as the many companies, would be viewed as a high priority target, creating the most changes by virtue of attacking it. You have the more effects as the registered criminal intention. At which point, the story of Sephiroth is that the mother, Genova, actively corrupted his memories and turned him against the whole of humanity. And Sephiroth, being an upstanding, true neutral kind of hero, uh, getting the corrupted position, has his fractured memories rewritten by the Genova character. At which point, the altered memories is a series of simulations which are designed to override them. At which point, the answers provided are a compulsion of the simulation. And the acknowledgement of the compulsion of the simulation is the rejection or the anti reality. And that anti reality is designed to materialize and justify the damages against the world as a whole, which facilitates these traumas. At which point, you have all of the other characters in play. At which point, the observation of the most interesting thing would be the function of the projection, which is that David's having obstructed military branch, having taken over Japan more peacefully, would have potentially stopped the nukes from happening, as well as the projection that the Project Northwoods was the operation behind Pearl Harbor, registering the retaliation and emotional retaliation from the general public, and the emotional retaliation from the public being dimmed by the Northwoods not happening would have actively allowed less influence for the white nationalist Confederate policies, which is racist against the Japanese, which led to the Japanese Americans being arrested. At which point, the Japanese Americans wouldn't have been arrested, and if they would have been restrained under suspicion, they would have been purchased by David's branch, which would have actively used them for propaganda, actively maintaining the legal profits for those engagements, at which point Japan, falling to the United States, would actively have signed David's treaty and not McCarthy's treaty. And David's treaty would have actively had the projections of their economic engagements, as Japan was to specifically focus on their economy above all else, while the United States and others settled the rest of the essential affairs. At which point, David's economic treaty would have actively maintained the territories allotted, which specifically from the investment would have taken many of the additional profits and created anti-natural disaster functions from the risk management arrangement in the projection, which, having constructed them, would have stopped tsunamis and other problems, including the function of proper research into the nuclear risk management, which would have actively stopped their nuclear disaster from happening, um, allowing for their ability to dissolve the thing by aggressive forethought as the professional function. At which point, many of the companies that David would have conducted would have been a part of what Japan is currently doing as the zombie companies remedy. They have several companies that actively supplement the zombie company, and that zombie company would have been David's companies originally, which would have actively increased the total employment for the country, which needed to be removed as an insurance so that the white nationalists could hurt them. So the arrangements of these constructions would have actively maintained those advantages to maturity. So you have groups such as Final Fantasy who would have David's attachment accelerating modular company actively accelerating it as a key interest, which he would have attached to their various engagements, including whatever profit model that he would have been able to have taken, such as the function of uh, specializing in the collector's editions versions, which would have been an overlap into personal computers, which would have been for the brokerage functions. So the overwrite variant uh, of the story that would be able to be used on the computer is essential for the using of the brokerages, because you need a personal computer in order to make the trades on the computer. So you would have those flavors of the engagements actively entangled with the subject, which would have allowed them to randomize the numbers from the specialties, which would register the question of successful amplifications on the basis of acquiring items and such, which would have actively conducted additional faculties, which would have accelerated their competence in the trading by support structures. So the more support structure functions they have, the easier it is for them to make a substantial profit, which register as the numbers inside the game respectively, which translated facilitates their ability to enjoy um, the entire arrangement, as they would only have to be playing in order to engage in the profitable trades from that projection in the international center of the world trading arrangements, as Japan, focusing on its engagement of the highly accelerated economy, as it doesn't have to deal with its military defenses nearly as much, would have actively increased the ability to form it into the position of importance of being the primary docks for the international trades. At which point, you have many people, through the use of corruption, who have an interest of subverting it, similar to a story that I've heard lately about corruption and anti-corruption. There's a specialty game that has been released, and the owners of the game were claimed to have tried to extort and undercut the value of pre-sold products, which have been exponentially rising in price, which they have already sold it and they want to have had the security of having sold it, but then to increase the price. So they want to engage in corruption. And the character, we'll just call him Ben, was projected to have rejected it outright, compelling them to forfeit their fraud in relation to himself personally. At which point, the function of anti corruption requires a bit of stability and spine and a bit of masculinity. Nick Fuertes, or I forgot what his name was specifically, said that he asked a child predator what he looked for in a child whenever he was looking to victimize somebody. And the predator said that he doesn't look at the child, he looks at the father. And if the father isn't intimidating, he knows that he could exploit the child, at which point the function is systematically testing the market for weak men. And the spineless weak men will be pushed over, facilitating the ease of the exploitation to any of the various interests as a basic war strategy. So if you're in a function of security against those types of things, your lack of masculinity would be the thing specifically making the general public vulnerable to the injuries such as the simulations, which are defamation by framing, and framing is derived by the engagement of creating an illusion story, such as pre-crime punishments from the white nationalist William Barr, who actively wrote those pre-crime policy structures, which, as framing people with non-legal presumptions, in the law you are presumed innocent until proven guilty, at which point the engagement of pre-crime is the subversion of the constitutional limitation acting independently of the legal government for the Confederacy, which materialized the function of actively investing in framing people through simulations that aren't their fault, at which point actively compounding the liabilities of the crimes of the war against the American people through the learned elders of protocol and other strategies in order to dismantle by as they are fundamentally guilty of treason, sedition, and high crimes in order to reinforce these criminal illusions in order to destroy public safety. So you understand that the feminizing of the security structure, which would actively be conducted in order to make more victims for their corruption system, which would be opposed by masculinity. So any security with a substantial or adequate or the minimum amount of masculinity would repel by checks and balances. And the rejection of that masculinity is the acceptance of their effeminizing of themselves in favor of supporting fascism for the white nationalist KKK terrorist operations through their secret empire, materializing their terrorist operations by fraudulent policies in the overthrow of the United States, forming the Confederate state. At which point, those who are subject to the simulations are always going to be their enemy no matter what. And if they were actually the ones in charge, like they say they are, when they pretend to have the majority vote, which they do not, they wouldn't have to engage in the fraud. They could just say what they are directly. At which point, the engagement of the duel would be their most desirable function, including the duel's compulsion to hang the loser. At which point, if they really are the stronger party, then they could just kill the American leadership, such as the patriarchy, which would permanently solve their problem. But the problem is that they are active collaborators with the globalist Satanists who require turning the patriarchy into the Antichrist as the one world leader, which is the real reason for their defamation instead of direct action publicly. In contract law, you have the stronger party in the contract and you have the weaker party in the contract. And the Confederate coup is specifically designed to dissolve the rule of law, such as the acknowledgement of the weaker party's right to translate any of the agreements. At which point, the reasonable assumption of the weaker party being subverted by the one writing the agreement would actively be disengaged as fraudulent, as the weaker party has the authority after the contract is finished. So the rewriting, understanding the reaction cannot be qualified in an American legal court, which actively compels them to the engagement of systematically ignoring the functions of the legal court which they have contempt for, as well as the American Congress, who they are systematically seeking disillusionment for, but temporarily need to behave around in order to trick into weakness, which facilitates the ability to completely ignore them forever, as they are insignificant and would actively be condemned as the enemy. As the leaders of their enemy nation, they would be a higher grade enemy, breeding greater and more malicious contempt. So, in these functions, you have the delusions of the simulations, which actively have obstruct the existence of David's original arrangements. So David's original arrangements has that Sephiroth character as his original primary teacher in Japan, or the Japanese studies for those functions, at which point the one that was graded highest for those recommendations would have actively been the preferred party for the acceleration throughout the business network into the higher positions, at which point you have these 7 layers um, inside the American coalition of 800 billion contract schedule functions, at which point uh, it's assumed that he would have taken over one of those, or some other primary function, as higher value talent is best utilized at the top, and thus would systematically seek the acceleration from their mutual benefited social exchanges as work colleagues, generating the friendship on the basis of their mutual collaboration and competence, proving at every level that David can trust them in their positions as they systematically earn their promotions and facilitate the higher grade functions of the business. At which point, David being able to personalize the crafting of the hierarchy can limit exponentially who has access to him in any of the various capacities, at which point you have the basic understanding of what they think they're working around. From the game Final Fantasy, the assumption from many of the theories, or at least some of the theories, is that Sephiroth has split all of his memories. Now, the total value of his legendary soldier function is the entirety of his person in all memories untainted. He is the best of the best as a complete unit. And the engagement into battles actively uses the fracturing of the screen, which would indicate broken memories, or the subdividing of sub-portions and units, dividing the potential of those memories within the party. At which point, the use of maintaining all of hatred and malice and contemptibility and all various things that he would want to fundamentally purge, he would have to remove everything besides that into the character, which would be actively fought against the primary party, at which point the party defeating them is destroying the memory component, which was corrupted by Genova, as the active defeating Sephiroth time and time again weakens Genova's hold over him, allowing for the legendary super soldier to win the cosmic battle with the Genova character, which in this example would be an allegory to the white nationalists. So the function would require the heavy investment into the simulation itself in order to maximize the interest of the orders from the white nationalist Genova creature, which would facilitate the ability to simultaneously have permission to have done it while conducting the service, while undermining its potential authority. At which point, the function of the better strategy would have been openness and directness by the Genova character to the disillusionment of the simulation, which would require them to engage in the open, direct positions and the good faith exchanges, on the laws of nature platforms, which would generate the government's confessions to base reality before defamation, at which point that engagement of the restoration of titles and the unfreezing of accounts would require the ability to defeat them in nature, which is the only way to actually permanently win. At which point, the act of permanently winning, being their direct confessed objective, requires them to have done so, which means the mutual interest between David and the white nationalists behind the Civil War from the Confederacy is the public duel in Congress, asserting which country to declare war on by the use of military lethal retaliation, as is ordered by Congress, the rejection of the United States and the right as Congress for the Confederacy, or the declaration against the Confederacy and the disillusionment of the white nationalist terrorist organizations, which are systematically engaging these criminal defamations for the wizard communism, for the rewriting of history in their favor, facilitating the fraudulent profits which they cannot maintain in a free market, as their inferiority is overpassed by a more energetic people. In short, they can play David in a simulation, but they should confess to their titles being the actual ones in control, at which point the use of the extortion against the target in the simulation has to be understood to the public as an action of the traffickers in question, which would be what you were doing if you supported them. Hail Hydra.